How do you deal with being bottom tier in a CV? Okay, so we're going to take an example of like a tier 8 CV and a tier 10 match. First off, if you're a tier 8 CV in a tier 10 match, unless the matchmaker is, really completely cracked out, there's probably some tier 8s, there's probably some tier 9s, there's probably some tier 10s. Usually it's going to be 4 of each. Sometimes it's like 3 of this, 3 of that, a bunch of tier 10s. It's going to be what it's going to be. But you have to recognize that there are targets that'll be on your level and targets that are not. Firstly, recognize your strengths. What does that mean? You may be in something that has long-range strikes, like skip bombs off a Russian CV. You may be in something that has long-range torpedoes. You may be in something that has long-range attacks, like Tiny Tims off of a Lexington. Recognize your strengths in that there are going to be some things that you'll have a better chance to be able to interact with in longer ranges, which means less AA for you. If you're in an Indomitable, for instance, you might be able to slingshot through AA. Recognize your strengths. Don't just look at a tier 10 match and go, well, fuck, I'm dead. Because that's not the reality of the situation. Every CV has things that it can do. Speaking of that, recognize weaknesses. So in this case, Lexington dive bombers. Now the torpedoes are going to come in from the side. The bombers are going to come in not only from the front, but they're going to hover in mid-range or in close range AA. Because they are so close to the ship while they're trying to do stuff, and other ships may be close by, very likely they're just going to get evaporated. They're not going to do anything, which is a real problem, yeah? So, in that case, your bombs may be specifically weak because the tier 10 AA is simply going to be too brutal. Another thing you could recognize as a weakness, maybe your planes are very slow. For instance, the rocket planes off of the British line are very slow. Sometimes the Russian CVs are pretty slow. You may have situations where the amount of flak that you're going against, because your planes are slow enough, you're not going to have a way in. So recognizing your strengths, recognizing your weaknesses, let's look at attack lines and capabilities. So in the very, very beginning of a match, you'll have something that looks like this, where you'll have ships displayed roughly evenly across 3 flanks. In this case, it's very likely that the destroyers in the front will move forward, away from their teammates. Because of that, they're theoretically going to isolate somewhat. You might be able to play off that. You might be able to make some kind of interaction play while the cruisers are still setting up, the battleships are still setting up, because there will be some form of isolation there. Secondly, the cruisers may do the exact same thing where they start to isolate, somebody moves out, whatever. And if you're in a tier 8 match against a tier 10, the tier 10 AA may be very powerful, but a single ship is still a single ship. You still have the ability to interact with them, even if it's going to cost you an extra, like if it would normally kill 2 planes at tier 10, it'll kill 3 or 4 at tier 8. But you can still get in and make the strike. The other thing about the attack lines and capabilities, once they've kind of moved and set up, you may have something like this, where you'll have a CV off in the middle of nowhere, way in the back, potentially supporting both flanks, which just by the nature of the fact that it's so far away, you might not want to go after just because it's so far away. But if there's a big giant open space in the middle, you could theoretically try to go for a CV snipe or drop fighters to get long range shots into the CV, because if you're low tier, so is the enemy CV. They may be having a lot of trouble finding places to go do something and be under the same pressure as you. So CV sniping is a possibility if you just do not have targets. But if we look at this, so maybe there's a destroyer in the front, there's a bunch of cruisers hugging some islands, some battleships in the back. Could you bomb this? Not with dive bombers, you'd probably just get all your shit killed. Could you rocket this? Yes, one way. So rockets are going to come in from a broadside position, so if you've got a nice empty space, you can come in and chip at the side, which is the exact same thing that you can do with torpedoes, and torpedoes often have a heal for most of the lines in the game, not on the Russian CVs, but Russians can drop, way back out at a distance to try to avoid AA interactions in the first place. Their torpedoes can go 6 kilometers. Japanese torpedoes do 5, I think it is. They used to do 6. So in these cases, you're not trying to go into the middle of the pack. You can't deal with stuff in the middle of the pack. You can chip at the edges of the pack. And you can do that with rockets and torpedoes and save your bombs in case some of the cruisers die or the DD isolates or something like that. so that you have options to where you can use your toolkit. You could also try to find somebody that's self-isolated and try to work on them, either by giving vision or spotting, etc., which I think we'll go over next, or find a more loosely organized pushing group, in which case you have more opportunities to go in without just being completely murdered. For instance, there's a battleship lagging in the back here that you could potentially get some interactions into, and you can again start striking in from the side, going for the chip damage on the edges of the blob. Now, you may see a ship that's extremely low health but is guarded by other ships, and you may have people that say, CV, what the fuck, why aren't you killing the low health ship? Realistically, if the AA is too strong and all you're going to do is lose too many planes to go in and do nothing in general, well, don't waste the planes, don't waste the time. Go for the thing you can go for. Don't go for the thing you can't. It's just not worth it. Information is actually very important in that it's not damage, but it's still damage from your teammates. So in this case, you may not be going in for chip damage, but your DD might have died. So the enemy has destroyed your destroyer, you've got some cruisers, you got a battleship, you can't stop this blob, but you can ping these dudes, please get the fuck out, please get the fuck out, please get the fuck out, while you come over, putting fighters in situations that there will be interactions as these guys move forward. So you can try to give information to your team. You could also come over and drop fighters maybe in a backline, which could potentially harass the CV with long-range bombardment from battleships. You could spot destroyers that are coming out to get interesting torp lines, or maybe that are crawling along doing secret mission stuff. There's often opportunities there, and while those opportunities may not include shooting, because sometimes the AA is too thick, or the targets are just too strong, or you've lost all your planes already because you ate a bunch of flak and son of a bitch. Information is still a viable thing. Using fighters, actually physically going somewhere to spot on a place on the board to give information to your team is still very valuable. There are some destroyers that will play an entire match without ever shooting their guns because they're just providing spotting. They're providing information. Next is going to be timing. Timing specifically is going to come down to literally what's the match. You've got an early game, you've got a mid game, and then you've got a late game. And realistically, this is not defined by actual time in the match. This is defined by how many people are still alive. So when you start the game, when you're in the early game, there are 12 people on both teams. Mid game is probably when about 4 people are dead. Late game is when about 8 people are dead. You know, it's the last 4 people slugging it out, trying to figure shit out, see if who can get a cap here, who can do this, who can somehow surprise somebody else, whatever. Late game is brawly. Mid game involves people making moves and being more aggressive. Early game is pretty standoffish, because if somebody tries to get brawly in the beginning 5 minutes of the match and there's still 12 enemies on the other team, he who goes forward first gets murdered by 12 people that are looking for something to kill. So early game is very standoffish. It's very clumped up. Mid game is where people start breaking apart. You have more interaction possibilities. And then late game is where everybody's kind of spread to hell. Now, if you can conserve your planes through the early game by not taking strikes or being very gentle with the strikes that you do, maybe you pre-drop, maybe you just choose not to take strikes where you can and instead provide information, or maybe some kind of fighter cover in case you have somebody that happens to be isolated that the CV is attempting to go after. When you start to save your resources for the mid game, or God forbid, save it all for the late game so you can just YOLO the shit in, well, you're going to be a little more impactful there because there's less AA on the field. Some people will say, well, there's also broken AA mounts. Broken AA mounts almost never amount for fuck all anything. So people that are saying, well, my AA is broken, congratulations. Instead of doing 400 damage per second, you're doing 325. Son of a bitch. Well, it says 50%. Well, you went from going 400 damage per second down to like 325. But it says more than that. I realize that, but it's still going to do a significant amount of damage, and Priority Sector does percentage health regardless of if you have one dude with a pea shooter or handgun or something, or maybe even a slingshot flinging rocks at your planes. So There's still going to be damage there. It's still going to do things. It is what it is. So the late game is not about trying to overcome the fact that AA mounts are destroyed. The late game is going to try to be using the fact that people will be spread to hell and back all across the map because people died and shit happens and stuff gets random over the course of a chaotic fight. Realistically, though, do not save all your planes for the late game because you have more planes than you have time in the late game. In the last 6 to 7 minutes, you may not have enough time to be able to YOLO through all your resources to really try and impact the fight and somehow pull it back or to keep it available. You need to start getting a little more aggressive in the mid game because you have resources to burn. CVs are given more resources than... maybe not more resources than they need, but they're given a generous ability to do stuff. Now, when you're up tiered, you're going to lose them faster than you would otherwise, but you still have planes to lose. You need to start using them when it becomes feasible, when it isn't stupid. Don't run in with 12 bombs on a midway, or not on a midway, but don't go in with 12 planes striking in on a Kaga to a blob of 8 ships. Because they're just all dead, and you've done 4,000 damage. Don't waste resources. But when it's not 8 ships, when it goes down to 5, that might be a time that you have to start YOLOing a few things in. Maybe you strike with some long-range torpedoes to try to harass from the sides without really just diving into the blob. Something of that nature. You're going to have to make those calls on the fly because it's going to come down to your decision-making. But understand that if you save all your planes for the late game, that just means you're going to end the game with a whole bunch of planes left over because it takes time to send out strikes and to do things, and you may not be able to burn through what you've saved. And then lastly is HP bait. Congratulations, you may be extremely ineffective. You might be one of the worst damage dealing things on the map. How could you say that? CVs are OP. Yeah, well, depending on what the enemy is, if you can't fucking touch them, or if they're in a balled up group in the late game where all 4 of them are in the same spot, you don't get to do anything. So it could just be literally that you throw your CV into the blender so they shoot you instead of a battleship because the battleship doesn't give a shit about AA. It just murders people in the face. And it's very, very possible that people are like... fuck that surface ship, I'm getting my ass a pelt, and they'll just shoot the CV exclusively. Now, don't sit there broadside waiting to get clapped in a single salvo. Try to make them work for it, because the longer they're shooting you, the longer they're not shooting a teammate. But understand, HP bait does not mean, well, whatever, they'll shoot me. You need to make sure they're shooting you instead of somebody else. Don't just be something for them to snack on between being able to shoot ship A and shoot B. You need to be putting yourself into the rumble while you're actually distracting for your allies that are doing something. They're getting shots in while the enemy's not shooting back at them because they're shooting at you. So realistically, some CVs are going to handle up-tiering better than others. The German CVs suck at up-tiering because they don't have enough penetration to get citadels, and German CVs need citadels. So that's going to be weaknesses. But what are your strengths? You move very fast. You're really good at getting information. So there's definitely that. You can try to swoop in on targets that isolate very quickly because you're very fast. So you're going to have some strengths, you're going to have weaknesses. Some are going to deal with it better than others, but you do the best you can through trying to recognize and run off of basically these 6 things. So hope that was helpful. Have a good one.